Tonight on Basic Black, the intertwined history of slavery and academia. Some of the nation's most prestigious universities were built with slave labor. Enslaved people served America's privileged sons as they were being educated. And top universities shaped the intellectual argument for racism in this country, an argument whose impact continues today. Next, the untold story of Ebony and Ivy.
Our panel tonight: Philip Martin, senior reporter, 89.7 WGBH Radio; Craig Wilder, professor of history, MIT; Callie Crossley, host, Under the Radar with Callie Crossley, WGBH; Kim McLaren, assistant professor of writing, literature, and publishing, Emerson College; and Peniel Joseph, professor of history, Tufts University. To join the conversation, please visit our website at basicblack.org.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of people have no idea about this history. We may be, if you were paying attention, you might have heard the stories about the report that was put out by Yale in 2001. And then I think the report that got a lot of attention was one about Brown University, when the president, Ruth Simmons, was there, and she asked them to look into this history of the slavery connection with Brown University, which is quite a lengthy one, an extensive one. But beyond that, people are like, what are you talking about? Maybe I know slaves built some of the buildings, but that's about it. So Craig Wilder, what prompted you to become interested in this long, what you call a long and sordid affair between slavery and academia?
Honestly, I had actually started writing an article. It was going to be a short little article explaining how Black abolitionists, the free African-American people who, free African-Americans in the decades before the Civil War, how they actually entered the professions, how they became ministers and doctors and teachers in a nation where they couldn't attend college. And then I got much more interested as I was sort of driving around to the places where they did study, and which were often, in fact, the houses of ministers and fairly informal educational arrangements. And so I began traveling around to these various sites. And as I was doing it, I became much more interested in their exclusion from those colleges, and in the role that the college played in both perpetuating their subordination within the society, but also how that related to the larger project of defending slavery.
Now, a few details, just so people get a sense of what we're talking about. When the privileged sons went to school, there were slaves there to wait on them. You know, describe a little bit of what the scenario was so people get a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I was recently looking at, when Thomas Jefferson went to William and Mary, and he's at William and Mary between about 1760 and 1762. About 10% of the boys at the school in that time period come to college with their slaves, and they pay an additional fee to house their slaves on campus. The college itself actually owned dozens of people who took care of the grounds. They cooked the food. They often, at many colleges, worked farms that supplied the college with the food that it needed to sustain itself. They mended clothes. They ran errands for the trustees. Right here in Massachusetts, the presidents of Harvard often had personal slaves who they used to do much of the college's business. Increase Mather, the president toward the end of the 17th century, actually sends his slave, who was a gift from his congregation, to run errands to the treasurer quite often.
So what we know is, and I just wanted to spell this, people may be thinking, oh yeah, well maybe that happened in southern universities, right, below the Mason-Dixon line. We're talking about elite institutions in the East, and the Northeast particularly. People don't put that together. But when we look at history like this, we want to ask ourselves, what is the meaning? So what did you take away from Craig Wilder's book and the meaning of this history, Kim?
Well, I think it's important to make the connection between the past. I think it's a fascinating book, and I think it is important to make that point that it wasn't just happening at the universities in the South, but it's happening here in Massachusetts, Princeton, which I forget what it was called, the College of New Jersey at the time, Princeton, Yale, the elite institutions. But I think to me, the more compelling part of the book, I mean, that's compelling, the history, but the way that these institutions which are built on slavery then perpetuate the mythologies, mass their resources to perpetuate the justifications for slavery, for this scientific racism. That to me is the more compelling point, both directly and indirectly. And I think that's really important because people don't understand, a lot of people don't understand that racism and the myth of racial inferiority did not just appear out of whole cloth in this country. It was manufactured deliberately over centuries, and that these universities had a part in that. I think is a very compelling point that people need to know.
So when we talk about the universities having a part in this, we're talking about shaping the intellectual framework for people who are going to lead the country, Peniel.
No, absolutely. I think the book is really brilliant, and one of the biggest things, it was an eye-opener for me too, is that it's really about a project of empire and how empire is constructed through these institutions and academies of higher education. And it's divided into two parts, but one of the interesting aspects is the way in which Native Americans are really interconnected here, because there's a project basically that becomes a project of genocide or people removal. And so Native American history and African American history are really connected here. But the really interesting aspect is the way in which initially this is British, French, Spain, different corollaries of those empires. By the late 18th century, it becomes an American revolution that's on one level anti-despotic and anti-imperialism, and on another level crafting its own new kind of imperial project, which includes connecting American universities with European universities, which he shows, and this whole science of empire and subjugation. Native peoples by this point are removed from the picture, including by our friend George Washington, the founder of the country, who really is a huge destroyer of Native Americans. So it's an extraordinary book, and it really gives the lie to this idea that American empire or American imperialism is this specific post-World War II project. It really shows us that the country, the founding of the country as sort of British and French and Dutch and colonial North America is really connected to this idea of empire. It's really at the cutting edge of history on slavery and race and democracy.
I also want to just mention that before you say that there is a novel by Geraldine Brooks called Caleb's Crossing, which addresses the first Native American graduate of Harvard University and uses much of the history that you that you have articulated in your book to talk about what was happening to that student and others as this process began.
Right, and Washington actually gets the nickname from the Iroquois of town destroyer.
Right.
In the aftermath of that Iroquois campaign during the Revolution.
Wow.
Meaning for you?
Well, to me, it's a number of things, but I think once again you see this grand look at history, a grand look at history. That's what I can say about your book, because we still live under this mythology as a nation, where our creed is so dramatically different from our historical realities, and we also look at history almost along parallel tracks instead of looking at the interconnectedness that history provides in reality, as we see with the role of the Native Americans and African people at these colleges. What Craig points out in his book is that Native Americans are displaced because they're seen as too close to the land. They might rebel, go back to the land that's in proximity to where they're now enslaved. Black people take their place. They grow rice. And we see ways, as my colleagues here have pointed out, ways in which these things are justified. Slavery is in some ways seen at the very beginning, embryonically, almost not just benign, but there's questions about slavery. And then the rationalizations begin. The scientific racism, as you call it. And I'm glad you didn't start off with terms like eugenics that we know, the whole notion of well-born, because these things came about from the academy in order to justify racism and to justify imperialism and to justify genocide. So I'm glad you started off by looking at how these things evolved as rationalizations. And it's and again, I think it's very important. It's a people's history of the academy. that you provide, and it's a history that we often don't get in the academy itself these days. And it's not just it's not strictly a case of obfuscation. It's a question of sometimes it's neglect, sometimes benign neglect on the part of the academy.
But in terms of the points that you're making in your book, a lot of these stories never told. How is that? Was that a deliberate cover-up of this history?
I think it's multiple things. I think on one level, there's just a tendency to evade the uncomfortable, and particularly in the histories of the institutions that are the sites where history gets produced. At Princeton, at Columbia, at Brown, at Harvard, at Yale. One of the striking things about those institutions is they've written their history multiple times over the past couple of centuries. They're thick with history.
But this wasn't in it.
Well, it appears in places and it doesn't. And when I first started the project, one of the things I expected was I thought it would be difficult to actually find the enslaved people who were on these campuses, if they were there at all. I thought it would be difficult to find the relationship between the presidents, the trustees, slavery, and the slave trade. In fact, actually, at every university archive I went to, at every state and county historical society around those universities, they were sort of rich with information on this relationship.
Just not articulate.
And the very people who had written the histories of the universities before, often faculty members, had come across the same material I was seeing. Some of it ends up in the histories. At Dartmouth, at Harvard, the enslaved people who were on the early campus, the enslaved people who were owned by the presidents, actually do get written about from time to time in the histories of the institutions. But what happens is they tend to write about them as caricatures. They tend to write about them as people with sort of grotesquely outsized flaws. And by lampooning them, by caricaturing them, one erases the moral problem of their enslavement. And you erase the historian and the academic, the intellectual's responsibility to explain how they arrived there and how they arrived in that condition and what kept them there, and the deep tension between their enslavement and the intellectual project itself.
Right. And of course, it raises the other question. I mean, you talked about whether or not this history was not fully explored, even though it's there around the edges, is partly our tendency to evade. But the other reason might be that it raises the questions of responsibility and perhaps even the dirty word reparations, right? Like what is knowing this history now, knowing how intricately linked, it's not incidental, but these grand universities, some of which, as we know, like Harvard, have quite an enormous endowment. What is their responsibility to the descendants of those very people, both specifically and more grandly to those who were affected by the scientific racism that they perpetuated? So that's my question to you. I think it's what is that?
Well, I think it relates to something we were talking about at the very beginning, the difference between the North and the South. And if you look at the histories of Southern schools, if you look at the recent histories, past 50 years of Vanderbilt and William and Mary, Wake Forest, the historians who wrote those stories of the universities, stories of the colleges, were often faculty members. But in Southern schools, there tends to actually be much more honesty about the relationship between the institution and slavery for two reasons. One is those universities are founded later. They're largely post-revolution. In fact, there's only one college in the South before the American Revolution, William and Mary. And so all of the others come afterwards. And then secondly, slavery is so completely completely surrounds these institutions that it will be hard to write the story of the school without it. But I actually think when you read them, especially in the past 30 years, they're not just much more honest about the relationship, but they actually have a kind of sophisticated argument about the role that slavery played in the evolution and in the building of these schools. It's in the northern schools that you don't see it. And here I think this sort of tendency both toward evasion and a tendency to avoid both the story of slavery and the moral responsibility for slavery gets reinforced by the long tradition of writing about slavery as a Southern phenomenon.
Yes. Let me turn this conversation just a little bit, and then you may be going in this direction, Peniel, and that is we want to establish that a lot of these schools were able to exist from slave money. So that needs to be clear. Brown was a good example. They really detailed, it was named for us, the Brown family that had extensive slave trade.
And in fact, actually, if you just to really quick way of understanding that is in North America, in British North America, there are only 3 colleges until 1701, right? Harvard, William and Mary, and Yale. In a less than 25 years, between 1746 when Princeton is founded and 1769 when Dartmouth is founded, 6 new colleges get established. They're all in the Northeast, and they're all established with direct relationships to slavery and the slave trade. This is actually the moment when the slave trade is peaking.
Right.
And
So
that's what allows them to be. Yeah.
I just want people to understand that, because there's a big mythology that, you know, slavery existed in one part of the country, never was happening here. And certainly folks, when it did happen here, nobody benefited from it. But this was huge benefits. But here's the term that I want us to be clear about, because you've referenced it obliquely here about the racial sciences and what was happening in those schools to perfect an argument as a justification for racism. So you begin talking about a young man, young white man, of course, going to school, and through his education, he learns to be a master. He's going to be master of this group of people, and that's his attitude. But that's the early part. Now, as it goes and we get closer and closer to these modern times, there is a shaping of why we're here and why we must do this. And the bottom line is that we're superior and they're not. That's really the bottom line.
Right.
And this is a young man who studied at Harvard, Henry Watson Jr. He's from Connecticut and East Windsor, Connecticut. He studies at what's Washington College, then now Trinity, and then finishes his degree at Harvard. And what he learns—
it's really not so much his story that I just wanted to highlight that you use
what he learns in one of his classes. He takes an anatomy class with the famous anatomist John Barnes Collins. And he learns, in fact, about he learns that the Negro sits at the bottom of humanity.
Right. All right. So my point to you is, though, from Henry Watson to now, how do we get to a point where these schools have been so instrumental in shaping now what a lot of people still believe?
Well, I think one of the things that Ebony and Ivy shows is the way in which right before, the decades before the Civil War, one of the things the book argues is that initially when scientists or intellectuals came to race, they weren't trying to initially use race to sort of circumscribe and marginalize people of color, including Indians and Africans. But as this process over decades gets established and evolved, they become the primary advocates for this separation of races. They become the primary advocates for the American Colonization Society, and really on the eve of the Civil War, they are using this pseudoscience. And at one point, Craig writes that race didn't just come to science and theology, it was injected into science and theology. And what's interesting about that is that there's this whole, and he describes this really great in the book, the Great Awakening and Christianity is really imbricated and interconnected here, because these social scientists or these intellectuals start to utilize these racial hierarchies to explain away slavery, not just in terms of hard sciences, but also theologically too. So there becomes a two-pronged. He shows really eloquently how Thomas Jefferson is saying that Phyllis Wheatley is just a parrot, that she has no Negro could ever have any original thought. And then there's another side of it through sort of a moral justification for slavery by saying that theologically, Christians,
which I think we're familiar with.
Yeah, we're familiar.
The moral part. We've seen that argument made before as people use the scriptures. Even in 12 Years a Slave, we saw that
So
very
it's
much.
twin strands. But one thing, the intellectuals here are really, really indicted as being culpable with the whole institution of slavery, justifying the whole institution of slavery. And universities were sites not only initially colonial outposts, but become places where they cultivate the young plantocracy. Right.
So let me just say, it's as if, just to put it in a real basic term, who's going to disagree with a Harvard study, I'm serious, with a College of New Jersey at that time, or Princeton? If they say it is, it must be so. These are the intellectuals. And before you speak, there is a book by Evelyn Hammonds and Rebecca Herzig called The Nature of Difference, which traces this very intellectual development in the sciences from Jefferson to today's genomics. Go ahead.
And another addition to Craig's work, I would say, would be the work in the 1970s, Alan Chase, a book called The Legacy of Malthus. And what this does is brings us to the present. And the reason it does that is because what you're describing is foundational. This is not something that's sort of dissipates over time. We still have many, many, many people in our country. who believe, no matter what is said about equality, no matter what is said about creed, that some people are genetically inferior, some people are genetically superior. There's this belief in cultural, inheritable
Well, they were
intelligence.
told that,
Yeah.
Philip.
That's
Yeah.
this is what I'm talking about.
And they're
And
still
this
told
comes
that.
from the academy.
Yeah.
This stuff is hard to break down.
Right.
It might have started, like in the 17th century, but it's hard to break down. It's hard to basically have something that foundational dissipate over time.
It gets perpetuated in the bell curve,
Right,
right?
right.
Perpetuated in
Now
the bell curve, exactly.
the terms are different now. It's about achievement gaps and about cultural differences, but it's the same. But it is important to know that it is linked directly
Like
to
how it
this.
started. I don't
Exactly.
think people understood how it started.
I'd
Yeah.
like to ask Craig about one of the best parts of the book for me is the epilogue, Cotton Comes to Harvard,
Right.
because it really gets into this whole idea of myth making
Right.
and people scrubbing the history. So you describe this really meticulous, really horrible history, but then in the epilogue, you show how even those who were implicated in the history started to remove themselves, rationalize that history, and I think that has come, and we're inheritors of their rationalization of that history.
Right. We're inheritors of a view of the university as a kind of benign and benevolent and passive institution
Right.
operating in society largely for social good.
Yes.
And it's a view of the university that has been crafted by universities. And so it's an extraordinarily privileged position to be in, to write one's own past. And it's precisely, as you were saying before, when science is radical.
Yes.
In its early 18th century origins, when you have lots of anti-slavery scientists and people who are attracted to science precisely because they want to make moral arguments on questions like slavery. And what happens to them is the same thing that happens to radical theology in the 18th century, right? It's when you begin to build churches and denominations around evangelical preachers, and all of a sudden they've got a building and a salary, that they get tamed. And it's precisely when you take scientists and you give them professorships and you begin to establish departments of the sciences and medical schools that European and American science, Atlantic science, gets tamed. And it gets drawn into the project of defending slavery because the funding for those institutions, the funding for the professorships and the medical schools, actually is coming from the same slave owners and slave traders who were on the board to begin with.
So here's the question. So here's the
Yeah,
question,
she's got a
Craig
great
Wilder, and I
little-
want to alert everybody that we're going to be continuing this conversation on the web. So now we know, because you wrote about it. You found it. We know how people distorted it. You know how people began it. You know how they threaded it through. And so now what? So the question, because people would say, so what are we to do with this information now that we have it? And what is the responsibility of institutions? As you know, Harvard, Drew Faust gave her approval of digging into, literally, Harvard slave history, and that report came out. Nothing since then, no response from the university, really.
I think it's actually even more complicated than that. When Ruth Simmons, the president of Brown, commissioned the Brown Report in 2003, this is right after she became president, and the report was released in 2006. I was almost 5 years into this project at that point, and I thought it was over. When the Brown Report came out, I assumed that all of Brown's sister institutions would actually begin to release reports, that Princeton would release one, Columbia. She had created, I think, such a perfect model for handling a difficult intellectual problem well, that I thought everyone would pick up that model, and none of them did. In fact, actually, I continued to do research on the book, assuming that, in fact, reports would come out. And, if it sort of took the light off what I was doing, that was fine.
And what was the model?
Well, the model that she created was, to put together a commission to just investigate honestly and openly, and to take seriously the academic obligation to pursue truth, not just about other people, but about ourselves and about our own institutions. It was a remarkable challenge, and I think by the time the report came out in 2006, certainly by the time it was released and consumed publicly, Brown was a healthier institution because of her
For having
stewardship.
faced it.
For having faced it. But unless that's linked to something, and I don't know what happened at Brown. I mean, I know that Brown is part of the...
There's a new center.
There's a new center for
Right.
slavery and justice.
Yeah.
There's some, they've done some things on the end of sort of trying to provide monies and scholarships for students. They've taken a number of moves, and then to try and memorialize the place of the enslaved on campus.
Because in some ways, the danger of this can be something like the apology, right? Did Bill Clinton made, or who made the
Or didn't
apology
make.
for slavery? Or didn't make, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, sorry, our bad.
Well, he really regretted it.
and then that's it, right? Unless there's action. I agree that should be the first step, and it is appalling that these other universities haven't done it. But then they need to be associated with direct action afterwards.
And I think there's some levels of or kinds of reparations that can be linked to most of these studies that were rationalized and justified and invented.
So are you suggesting there should be reparations?
I'm suggesting under
absolutely.
Absolutely. That's what I'm
certain
suggesting.
circumstances there should be reparations, but not just in this country. The same thought processes that were both basically cultivated, boiled at Harvard and boiled at Brown and other universities. This was also in place in Australia to justify the genocide, if you will,
but
against Aborigine people, and not just in.
Well, don't go far afield from
I'm not going far afield. I'm
I'm
simply saying that it rationalized. It rationalized genocide in this country against Native Americans. It did indeed. I know it's hard for many Americans to hear even the term genocide because our culpability is something, like that we still don't acknowledge us as a nation. And the Academy certainly doesn't
I got that.
acknowledge it.
All right. What about Neil?
I think there should be reparations. I think, one, Brown is a model. It needs to go further. Places like Princeton, Harvard, here's what reparations would be. It'd be a specific number of faculty and staff that have to be added. They have to be people of color. They have to be people of African descent, the African diaspora, be a specific number of students. It would be Native Americans, and it would also be specific community outreach.
And that's what I'm interested in.
To continue the conversation, see past episodes, or discover new stories, please visit our website at basicblack.org.